And just before we move into some first presentation around private rented sector, there's just a few facts and figures for you around why we've been interested in this topic for a little while. If you look at the country as a whole and all the housing, around 18–19% of the population live in the private rented sector, but just 6% of DFGs are awarded to people living in the private sector. So certainly if you compare that with the social rented sector, where it's actually smaller, but 6 or 7 times more DFGs go to the social rented sector than go to the private rented sector. I think it's also interesting that if you look at people over 65 and how much they move, then if you live in the private rented sector and you're over 65, you're much more likely to move than anybody else. So I think that goes to show that probably a lot of the accommodation in the private rented sector isn't particularly suitable for people as they age or with disabilities. And there is a potential real market there for landlords getting involved with providing accessible housing. So that's certainly been something we've been interested in for a while.
And now it's time for the guest.
So I'm very pleased that Meera Chindooroy from National Residential Landlords Association is with us this afternoon, and we'll be introducing their brand new report, which was launched today, on adaptations in the private sector and guidance for landlords. So over to you, Meera.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you everyone for your time today. So I think we've got about 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and rattle through these so we have enough time for some questions. So the NRLA was formed last year from a merger of the National Landlords Association and the Residential Landlords Association. We are the largest trade association for private residential landlords with over 90,000 members, and we provide support to those members through services such as our advice line, through resources that are available to them, training, meetings, webinars, as well as our campaigning work. Our vision is a rental sector that works for all, and that means that it needs to work for both landlords and tenants. Our members on average have a portfolio of around 8 properties, and this is quite heavily skewed by those with larger properties. So most of our members have around 2 to 4 properties, which is quite key as we get into the detail of some of their feedback. So why adaptations? As I mentioned, our vision is a rental sector that works for all, and the private rented sector now accounts for around 20% of the housing tenure in England. Research by the APPG on housing and care for older people has suggested that the proportion of households in the private rented sector which are headed by someone aged 65 or over will double by 2046, reaching 12%. So although there's a relatively small proportion of older tenants in the sector at the moment, we know that there is going to be increasing demand for adapted properties in the future from those tenants, and also from others who are living with disabilities. And landlords need to be prepared for these changes and to future-proof their property portfolios and also their business planning to make sure that they can appeal to as wide a variety of tenants as possible. But there is a perception that landlords are not open to adapting their properties. We hear from tenants that they don't always feel comfortable approaching their landlords, or that they've been rejected for adaptations in the past. So we wanted to explore why that was and what the situation was for private landlords, because there hadn't actually been much of any research around how private landlords were engaging with adaptations. And as Paul mentioned, only 8% of DFGs currently go to private tenants. So we knew there was an underrepresentation of the private rented sector in the application of DFGs. So today we've launched a report that looks at some of these issues and is based on conversations that we've had with stakeholders, as well as research that we've done with our own members. So in this first chart, you'll see that we asked our members how whether you let to tenants who have accessibility needs at the moment. So just around 8% of our members currently let to tenants with accessibility needs. But you'll see that this rises to a third of those with large portfolios. For those landlords who have 20 properties or more, 34% of them let to tenants with accessibility needs, for those landlords with 1 to 2 or 3 properties, it's 3% or less of landlords who currently do so. So in terms of the landlords in the private rented sector, the majority of landlords in total across the sector are landlords who own 1 or 2 properties. So around 40 to 45% of landlords only own 1 property, according to the English Housing Survey. And so many landlords have never been approached about adaptations previously from their tenants, and particularly if they do own only 1 or 2 properties, they're unlikely to have ever received a request. So there is quite a lot of misconceptions around adaptations from landlords, and we'll see that in the findings from the rest of the research. So next slide, please. The biggest barrier for our members in terms of making adaptations was the cost of undertaking works. So 85% of members who responded found that this was a barrier. And through our work, we found that actually landlords aren't expected to cover the cost of adaptations. So there's funding available both for major and minor adaptations, and landlords aren't aware that this funding is available. So it was important to address this misconception, and that's what our guidance aims to do. The next biggest barrier was that landlords perceived that they wouldn't receive any rental income whilst installing adaptations. And it was really notable from engaging with stakeholders that there are only rare occasions when tenants need to leave properties for adaptations to be made. In the vast majority of cases, those adaptations can be made with the tenants in situ. So this will make a big difference to landlords who are concerned about the associated costs of adapting properties, for example, if there are going to be void periods whilst the tenant isn't in the property. Also high on the list of barriers is the cost of removing those adaptations at the end of the tenancy. And landlords will often think about adaptations as looking clinical or unsightly, and making a property less desirable for any tenants who don't need adapted properties. But we know that there are many options for modern, stylish choices, and landlords can create properties which appeal to a wide range of tenants, and also highlight access features of a property that they may not be aware of that could be suitable for different types of tenants, for example, level access to a building. So we highlight this in our guidance, and also the fact that some local authorities have discretionary funds to make good any major changes, for example, removing a stair lift at the end of a tenancy. Next slide, please. Overall willingness to let to tenants was around 50%, but again, this ranged quite significantly. So those landlords with 1 property were much less likely to be willing to let than those with more than 20 properties. And if we take a look at the next slide, this explores the knowledge of DFGs. So 79% of landlords didn't know anything about DFGs when we presented them with information around them. And that was lowest for those with 20 or more properties, but even for this group, over 2/3 of landlords didn't know anything about DFGs. So that first barrier around the cost of adaptations was a really key one to address, and to break down some of those misconceptions and ensure that landlords were aware of the level of funding that's available to them. Next slide, please. So once landlords did understand about DFGs and the funding that's available, their willingness to make adaptations increased significantly across the board. And you can see that 68% of landlords were more willing to adapt their properties, which is a significant shift and shows the impact that increased engagement with landlords can have for the sector. Next slide, please. So taking on board our research and conversations with stakeholders, we identified that there was this gap. There was no guidance specifically targeted for private landlords, and there was a lack of engagement from local authorities with this sector, which meant that the possibility of utilising the private rented sector for those who needed adaptations wasn't taken forward in the same way that it could be if there was greater communication and engagement. Next slide, please. So we have produced some good practice guidance, which is aimed at demystifying the adaptations for landlords and providing a simple explanation of what kinds of things they need to consider if they're approached by a tenant around making adaptations to their property. The guidance is just 11 pages long, and including any links to more information, and it provides an overview in accessible language for private landlords, addressing their key concerns, and really aimed at landlords who have little to no understanding of adaptations or around why tenants might need adapted properties and what kind of adaptations they may need. We developed the guidance with the support of 12 specialist organisations, including foundations and the others on this slide. And it was really key for us to engage with a wide range of stakeholders to ensure that we got as much insight as possible into the needs of different types of tenants, and also insight from organisations that are already specialising in providing homes to people with accessibility needs. So organisations like Ham and Teg, Branch Properties, Golden Lane Housing were all really instrumental to identifying how to make properties adapted to tenants, whilst also addressing the needs of landlords in terms of the considerations that they would need to make. Next slide, please. So our guidance covers quite a range of questions and mainly targeted at those sorts of barriers that landlords have identified. So we give an explanation of what adaptations are at the very simplest level, and also what minor and major adaptations are. When landlords think about adaptations, often what they will be thinking of are major adaptations, are things that are going to cost a lot, are going to make a big difference to their property, things like a stair lift or perhaps structural changes. But we know that the majority of adaptations that are needed are often minor adaptations, that things like grab rails, which won't actually be that disruptive to the landlord or to the tenant, and can make a big difference to the tenant's quality of life. We've also given a lot of information about how adaptations are funded, both minor and major, and sources of funding which landlords and tenants can consider, and also highlighting that landlords aren't expected to provide funding for those adaptations themselves, but that the key part is that they give consent for the works to be carried out. We also explain around the issues of the visuals of the adaptations, that if the landlord does want to pay towards the cost of the adaptations to get a different type of adaptation that is more suited to the style of their property, then that is something that they are able to do. And around DFGs, one of the key issues that came up was around the landlord's need to provide confirmation that the property will be let to the tenant for for 5 years. And there was some concern from landlords around whether that means a fixed 5-year tenancy. But our understanding from stakeholders is that it doesn't have to be a fixed 5-year tenancy. It's an intention to let rather than a commitment to that tenancy continuing for 5 years on a fixed term contract. And so this will help to alleviate some landlords' concerns about providing a fixed term contract for that length of time, which is really unusual in the private renters sector. And finally, we talk about how landlords can work with an agent, and particularly around making clear to your agent that you have an interest in ensuring that your property is accessible to people who may need adaptations, and making that clear in any promotion that the agent does for your property when they're reletting it. Slide, please. So who can use this guidance? The guidance is aimed at private landlords, and mainly those with a smaller portfolio or who have little or no experience with adaptations. It's intended to be used by a wide range of bodies. So it can be used by local authorities who are looking to engage with landlords to adapt their properties, or by tenants who might be approaching their landlords about adaptations and want to provide further information which will help landlords to understand what they're requesting. So please do take a look on our website for the adaptations campaigns page, where you'll be able to download the guidance and also download our report, which has more information. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's next, the guidance was one of the key findings from the research which we did, and we've taken that forward. But there were a couple of other recommendations which the report takes forward, which we're also really keen to pursue. Next slide, please. So the first of these was a series of schemes for local authorities to explore pilot schemes with local landlords to develop a more positive engagement between local landlords and local authorities on this issue, and improve the processes of working with local landlords in order to create a best practice framework for engagement. So we know that there are some examples of positive engagement that local authorities have already had with landlords, but they are pockets in different parts of the country, and there isn't really consensus on the best way to engage landlords on adaptations. So we were keen to use the opportunity of the development of this guidance to help to develop pilot schemes with those local authorities that can take this guidance a step further, rather than it being just a passive piece of passive documentation which local authorities can use to really develop a more proactive engagement with local landlords and help to harness the opportunity available in the private renters sector. Next slide, please. And the second area that is really key for us is developing or promoting more case studies of landlords who successfully adapted properties and successfully continue tenancies with individuals who need adaptations. And the importance of case studies is that this can help to show landlords that this is something that I can do as well. If someone else has already done this, this shows that this is possible for me, and also that I can, as a landlord, I can see the process that this person has gone through and the kinds of things that they have considered. So case studies are a really powerful way of communicating the opportunity to adapt your property and the benefits of this for landlords. However, it's hard to find many case studies within our membership, purely because there's a small proportion of the membership who currently have adapted properties. So if there are future pilots with local authorities, these could help develop more case studies. And also, if anyone listening today has any case studies that they're able to share with us, please let us know, as we're keen to promote any good examples of good practice that we can. We have our guidance and our report on the website, on our campaigns pages and adaptations pages, and please do also drop us a line if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Meera. There are a few questions that have come through on the chat. So families have expressed concerns about landlords increasing rent when adaptations are completed. Did you see much evidence of that as you were talking to landlords, or an intention to do that, or a wish to do that?
That isn't something that we've seen much intention around. I'd be interested to see what evidence that there has been around that. I think that it's one of those issues that tenants may have concerns about, but may be addressed by some of these risks that landlords perceive around adaptations, around not being able to relet the property, or having to cover the cost of removing adaptations at the end of the tenancy. So there may be a more complex story behind that, but I'd be definitely interested to see any evidence there is around it.
Great. So if anybody's got any case of that, then please let us know. Helen was saying that she's really pleased that there's I suppose, kind of this sort of information coming from the landlord side, because she feels that landlords don't always take on board fully what local authorities are telling them. So kind of having something independent is really helpful. So we will share the videos afterwards, not necessarily the slides, so you get the full context of what we've been doing. So there was a question from Angelina around perhaps what a landlord may or may not do if perhaps a bathroom was being funded through DFG to kind of fairly basic level. But maybe if kind of the landlord wanted to pay, or the tenant wanted to pay for an upgrade, I assume that happens from time to time. So you kind of get a lovely bathroom that kind of people would want to use in the longer term, rather than just I guess kind of a fairly dull bathroom that nobody really wants.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing that we are quite clear on in the guidance is, you know, if the funding is coming through public funding, then it may not cover the sort of more stylish bathroom fixtures that a landlord may want. But if the landlord wants to top up that funding in order to make other choices, then they are free to do so. But that would be up to the landlord to make that decision, or if they wanted to discuss that with their tenant, then they could do so. Great.
And yes, do kind of confirm the point you made, that it's only an intention to live in the property for 5 years. You don't have to have a kind of fully signed, sealed, watertight lease for the next 5 years to be able to access a DFG.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the important part of that is that most landlords will want to have tenants who are in properties for longer periods. So, you know, it's not that the landlord wants to end that tenancy before 5 years, but it's more around sort of having that fixed term rather than a sort of rolling contract, which is more common in the private rented sector, which might put off some landlords.
Yeah. Do you think there'd be there is also kind of provision within the legislation regulations for the landlords to actually apply for the grant themselves? I don't know if you asked about that as part of the research, and there is also kind of a link provision for the local authority to have nomination rights if they've given a grant to a landlord. Do you think there would be, so I suppose to a certain extent it kind of guarantees tenants will be taking up an adapted property for potentially the next 5 years. Do you think that would be of interest to landlords to kind of have that security of tenant, I guess, over a longer period?
Yeah, I think there's it really depends on the landlord who's being engaged. As I was saying, there's lots of different types of landlords in the sector, and those landlords who have 1 or 2 properties, smaller portfolios, probably just aren't going to be in a position to make those sorts of applications because they don't have the knowledge to be able to do so. Larger landlords may be in a better position to do so. So I think it's really a matter of having that conversation with the landlord and seeing what works for them and what approach would be most suitable. And it's really I can't really say there's a sort of one size fits all, because the variety of landlords in the sector is so broad.
Yes. Yeah. And if we're kind of looking at some kind of pilot projects to try some of this stuff out and kind of develop policy and practice further, who would you like to come forward? Do you have any preferences in terms of location or size, or?
We're keen to get a variety of locations across the country. So, we don't want it all to focus in one area, and possibly some different types of sort of sizes of local authority as well. But really, anyone who would be interested, please do get in touch, because I think just some small pilots would be a really helpful way of helping us to build up our evidence base around this.
Great, thank you. So if anybody's interested in being part of a pilot, then either pop your details in the chat or contact us afterwards, and we'll put you in touch with Meera and her colleagues. So thank you, Meera. Thank you for joining us today and giving us a chance to launch your report, which I've been looking forward to reading and seeing. So if you need anything else with kind of pushing the report and making it available to as many people as possible, then yeah, very happy to help.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. I should have mentioned we have a hashtag, which is #AdaptPRS. So if anyone's on social media and they want to take a look at that hashtag or post about the guidance, please do.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.